Awesome. Thank you so much, Beth. And hello, welcome everyone to today's two-track event webinar on board development and governance. We're excited to have John D. Miranda here to present about his knowledge on this topic. So that's really exciting. Before we go ahead and get started, I did just want to make a quick note that both the foundational track and the advanced track will be recorded and will be uploaded to the site just so that everyone has access to both webinars. Okay, so before we go ahead and get started, I wanted to start off with an Indigenous land acknowledgement, as we respectfully acknowledge that we live and work in territories where Indigenous nations and tribal groups are traditional stewards of the land. Our California office resides in the Tongva territory. Please join us in supporting efforts to affirm tribal sovereignty across what is now known as California and in displaying respect, honor, and gratitude for all Indigenous people. For those of you who would like to learn a little bit more about whose land you're on, please follow one of the following options. Okay, and I won't go into depth with this because I know all of you know our PWI and EPOC administrative team, but this is just the wonderful people who are behind this and making it all happen. So very excited and thankful to have them all on board. Okay, so now I just wanted to review the community agreements with everyone. So just as a reminder to be present and be an active listener. I know John D. Miranda put a lot of work into this. I'm really excited for all of you to hear his amazing work and everything that he has to share. So just make sure that you're being an active listener. Remember, one mic, one voice. So if you have any questions or concerns, please make sure to raise a hand function so that we can go ahead and address questions as they're coming in. Make sure to practice inclusivity, honor pronouns and gender identity, and be respectful of one another. Show respect, as this might look a little bit different for each person. Allow conflicting perspectives to exist. I know that maybe not everyone will agree on the same things, so just make sure that conflicting perspectives might exist, but again, just make sure that you're respectful to one another. Assume best intentions, as everyone is here to learn and gain new information and new skill sets. Take space and make space. So if you already shared, please give some space for others to come up and share and speak as well, so that we can all be collaborative and learn from one another. Share where you're comfortable sharing. There will be times where grantees will be asking questions, or during the Q&A section that some questions will be said. So if there's something that you're comfortable sharing, go ahead. If not, it's completely understandable. Protect individual privacy. So whatever someone says, whether it's pertinent to themselves or to the organization, just make sure that it's you respect their privacy and what they're sharing with everyone. Practice self-care. So if you need to stand up or anything or take a little break, go ahead and do that. But again, just make sure that you're being an active listener and just respectful of everyone. Encourage growth of self and for others, and support resource sharing. So at the end, we'll be having a Q&A discussion to ask any questions that you may have about the presentation, or if maybe you realize that you have some resources similar to the ones that John will be sharing, then just go ahead and share them to the chat, or you can even raise your hand and share with everyone else on this call. So just a quick overview about the two-track event details, at least for the foundational track. So today, everyone will be learning about the importance of bylaws and the board of directors, and why that's important to have in an organization. What are some of the best practices in creating the job descriptions? Then we'll also be talking a little bit more about the Roberts and Roberta's rules of order and what that means to have it, how to run effective board meetings, and just understanding what some successful methods are for recruitment of board members. So that's the overview for the foundational track. And again, some of the target audience for this foundational track is newer nonprofit organizations with less than 5 years of experience in this setting, those who are seeking solid understanding of board development and what that means, and participants looking to build their board beyond startup. So I'll just review the foundational track for now, but again, the advanced recording will also be available for everyone to view after this. So with that being said, I'll go ahead and pass this over to John D. Miranda.
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Okay.
Yes.
Happy to be here this morning. I have a variety of experiences with nonprofit boards, having started several nonprofit organizations and provided consultation to other nonprofits, including RCOs, and helping to start a couple of RCOs, recovery community organizations. I served on the board of the Institute for Nonprofit Organization Management at the University of San Francisco. Been very interested in nonprofit organization and development. I'm also a person in long-term recovery. So let's move along here. Learning objectives for today. By the end of this training, you hopefully will understand the importance of bylaws in nonprofit organizations. Understand best practices in determining board roles and responsibilities. Be familiar with the famous or infamous Robert's Rules of Order. Have tools to effectively run board meetings and understand how to successfully recruit board members. I'm going to make a few assumptions about what we're doing today and who you are. I'm assuming that you work in a nonprofit or are in the process of developing a nonprofit. And for many who have been in nonprofit organizations delivering services as staff members, oftentimes the board is kind of this mysterious entity, this mysterious group off in the somewhere in the background. But what I'm hoping to do today is really kind of demystify what's involved with a nonprofit board and what a board should look like, how it operates. We're going to look at bylaws, which are the kind of the Bible of the nonprofit. A lot of the intricacies of the nonprofit are governed by the bylaws. We're going to talk about board key responsibilities. What is the focus of the board? There's often, some tension in organizations between the board's view of things and the staff's view of things, and sometimes there can be conflict, and we're going to touch on that. How to recruit new board members. What are the kinds of people you want to serve on a board? The role of board officers, and then some discussion of the board culture and dynamics and how to run effective board meetings. We're going to cover a lot of content, so I want you to not worry about that because you'll have the PowerPoint to download. And as we go forward, I'm not going to read everything. I'm going to try and give you a few examples of some of the experiences I've had to kind of round out what is in the content PowerPoints. So first, bylaws. Oops, jumping ahead. They are required anytime a nonprofit incorporates. It's required that the bylaws be submitted. So bylaws tend to be developed pretty early and often need to be changed as the nonprofit grows and evolves. Its bylaws are a kind of a living document that should be regularly consulted by the board to determine how it's to proceed. I've been in board meetings where bylaws are, kind of nobody knows what's in them. Nobody even knows where to find a copy of them. And in an effective organization, in a high performing organization, the bylaws are there because they tell you how to proceed. And they limit and expand roles of individuals and activities. The bylaws are really a kind of a living document that guide the nonprofit. In the bylaws, there's basic organizational information, a statement of purpose that clearly states the organization's mission and purpose. This is pretty important because when you approach foundations or government organizations for funding, often one of the things they want to know is, what is your mission? And that's not something you make up as you go along. It's something that's foundational and that's written in the bylaws. And that any effort to change that is a serious consideration and requires board, staff, and probably stakeholder involvement. The bylaws also talk about the board structure, how the board will do its business, what are the maximum and minimum numbers of directors, and how the organization interacts with the community. There may be specific statements in the bylaws about the organization's role in the community and interaction with other stakeholders. And then the bylaws will also outline the officers, their titles, and what they are expected to do. Boards work best when the board as a whole makes decisions that are brought to the board by the subcommittees of the board that actually get involved in the nitty-gritty. So a board might have a finance committee, it might have a strategic planning committee, it might have a committee that looks to expand the board and recruit new members. All of those committees would report to the full board, and action items will be taken by the full board. The bylaws also suggest or state any compensation that board members receive. It's not usual that in nonprofits, boards are compensated. It's more likely to happen in the for-profit world. But another aspect of the bylaws is making sure that directors understand their liability as board directors. Because the board of directors is the governing body of the board, they are ultimately responsible. And if things go south, let's say there's some embezzlement on the part of a staff person, the directors are really the ones responsible and accountable. And for that reason, most nonprofits have directors and officers insurance in place to protect the board members from any litigation or liability. Bylaws also tell the board, members of the board, how to elect new officers and directors, how votes are counted. Often there's an annual discussion about conflict of interest, making sure that board members have no conflict of interest. And this gets a little, this is important for recovery community organizations, because oftentimes a board member might be also sitting on the board of a treatment program in the same community. And while that's okay, it's important that that board member understand that they have a duty of loyalty to the board, and that means they have to avoid any conflicts of interest with the treatment program or semblances of conflicts of interest. Bylaws specify the voting rules. Bylaws establish procedures for amending their procedures and for amending the bylaws. Sometimes there are very detailed membership specifications in a bylaw. For example, an organization might feel that in order to accurately reflect the recovery community, it's important that a certain percentage of board members be persons in recovery. And while that sounds kind of simple, that can also create a lot of discussion about, well, what is recovery? What are we talking about here? Who legitimately meets that criteria? Do process addictions come into play, or is it strictly substance use disorder recovery? Also, the bylaws might specify specific communities of interest to be included on the board. Men, women, LGBT, persons with disabilities. And these become pretty important for the organization, because not most, but many grantors, whether they're government agencies or foundations, are very interested in the makeup of your board of directors and want to see how the board reflects the community that you serve. And that's really a key statement. The board should reflect the community you serve. The staff should also reflect the community that you serve. And sometimes in developing a proposal for a particular government agency or foundation, a nonprofit really has to specify how many and who. I remember a number of years back, there was a federal agency that served juvenile populations. And they had an RFP, a request for proposals out there. And in order to apply, the applicant had to identify the numbers of young people that served on the board. They couldn't just say, oh, we have young people represented in our organization. They had to specify the number of board members, what percentage, what number of individuals were actually youth. So it can get pretty detailed, and it can be pretty important who you have on your board. Okay, we're going to talk about some of the key responsibilities of board members. Let me make sure I've got, okay. Board members must demonstrate and exercise prudent care in terms of their responsibilities and the nonprofit organization that they oversee. They must read and understand financial reports and be willing to question expenditures and examine variances in overseeing financial management. And this can get pretty detailed. Sometimes it might be in the interest of the board of director, of the executive director, to submit financial reports that are, kind of overview of the finances of the organization. But it's up to the treasurer, and we'll get to particular board officers in a bit, but it's up to the treasurer to really look at the general ledger every month. The general ledger is where every expenditure is identified, so that a treasurer looking at a general ledger can say, well, what's this for? And what's that for? And what is, there's a large payment here. What was that for? That kind of scrutiny is really important. And if it isn't happening on a regular basis, it's pretty easy for the executive director and the board to really kind of trip over each other sometimes on some of these expenditures. Boards are also responsible for strategic planning and achieving the nonprofit's short and long-term goals. The board is the governing agency, and it must ensure that when the organization, for example, has a government contract from an organization like the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, which provides a grant program called Building Communities of Recovery. Well, within that grant agreement, there are deliverables that the organization must meet. And it's up to the board to make sure that the board is working toward those deliverables and is achieving those deliverables. A major responsibility of the board is the hiring, supervising, and evaluation of the executive director. And the relationship between the executive director and the board, and especially the board president or chair, is very, very important. Boards are also responsible for fundraising and development. And here it's more the overseeing of the fundraising operation and the development operation of the nonprofit. Board members individually may have a responsibility for personal fundraising, personal donations. We'll touch on that when we get to a later slide, but the general rule is board members are supposed to give, get, or get off. And I mean, give some money or get some money. Board member may not have the individual wealth to donate substantially to the organization, but they might have friends that they could call on. They might be members of organizations that give to nonprofit organizations. Maybe their employer has a matching gift program for nonprofit organizations. So, the getting can supersede the giving. But if a board member is doing neither and there's no expectation that the board member get, then really they should consider stepping off the board. The board member has a duty of loyalty to the organization's interest and to prioritize that over themselves. They may have conflicts of interest. They are not there to be able to show that they're, important by virtue of being on the board, although there is a certain amount of status associated within communities and sometimes within people's employment to being on particular boards. But their duty is to the organization, and they have a duty of obedience to the organization as well. And that is that they will look out for the interests of the organization and refrain from any self-serving aspects of being on a board. Oops. So we're going to talk a little bit more in a little bit more detail about the ethics associated with nonprofit involvement. But here, every organization should be involved in strategic planning. Maybe a 3-year plan, maybe a 5-year plan, maybe a 1-year plan, or some combination of all of those. The board oversees the strategic plan. And this is a good time to mention that boards are rightfully involved in policy, but not in execution of policy. That's the staff function. So boards have the big picture. They oversee where the organization may be going, but it's really up to the staff to deliver and execute on the policy. So as the strategic plan is being developed by the staff and the executive director, and maybe with some outside consultants, the board needs to be staying informed about the creation of that plan, maybe ensuring that all stakeholders are being represented in the development of that plan, and creating some accountability on the implementation and completion of the plan. I was at a board meeting a few years ago, and I was there to discuss a strategic plan that the board was considering taking, and it was kind of interesting. At one point, one of the board members said, well, we did a strategic plan 3 years ago. And then another board member piped up and said, we did? And then another board member piped up and said, well, where is it? And another board member said, well, I don't know, it's lying around here somewhere. But this is an example of a board kind of, shirking or denying its responsibilities for the implementation of a strategic plan. It is not something that belongs on a shelf. It is a living document, and similar to the bylaws, they don't belong on a shelf. They belong in practice. And here we get back to the financial situation of reviewing financial statements every month. Should be, hopefully the board meets every month. Sometimes you might have a board that meets every other month, but quarterly is probably not a very good idea. Monthly meetings are really the standard and the best practice. And in that monthly meeting, the treasurer's report and the executive director's report provide a clear picture of incoming and outgoing funds, revenues, and expenses. So board members need to be able to assess financial statements and make informed decisions based on these statements. Now, you may very well need to train board members. Many people will come on a board without this experience or this expertise. So it really is part of a board to be constantly educating itself about what it needs to know to do the job of being a board member. And this is probably a good place to mention, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. We will be spending some time at the end of the formal presentation to discuss questions and answers. Okay. So again, the board focused fundraising and resource development. We talked about giving, getting, or getting off. Board members can be very helpful in opening doors. And in my opinion, a good way to kind of think about board members is that they're really ambassadors for the organization out in the broader community. Okay, while the organization is busy delivering its services and doing what it does best, caring for people either in need of recovery or in recovery, board members can represent the organization into the broader community. And assessing each board member's relationships with other organizations can be an important way to do this. So I served on a board where we would regularly, annually, ask each board member to describe their outside affiliations, okay? Did they belong to a church? Did they go to Rotary? Were they members of Seroptimist? And just to give you one example, I remember one board member was a member of a particular congregation. And he knew that that congregation regularly gave money to nonprofit organizations. So he was able to represent the organization to his religious congregation. And not only did they make a grant, but eventually, after a couple of years of grant making, they actually included that nonprofit in the congregation's budget so that they could rely on an annual contribution from that congregation to the nonprofit. That's pretty cool. That's pretty good thing for a board member to be able to do, to get those funds. And usually board members work pretty closely with fundraising staff if you have fundraising staff, but small organizations, startup organizations are probably not going to be at the level where they have fundraising staff. So how do we recruit new board members? It's for starters, understanding who you already have on your board can be important to try and figure out what you need going forward. And this is why an annual what's the right word? Membership tally of who sits on the board, what's their recovery status, perhaps what is their disability status, what race or ethnic group or aspect of the community do they come from. All of this can be gathered, and sometimes it's touchy. Sometimes board members get a little touchy about having to reveal this kind of information. And it's important to explain to them that this is for the good of the organization, to be able to make sure that funders understand that the board and the staff reflect the community. But you also have to respect the privacy of a board member who may not want to reveal this information. I was involved in a board a number of years back where a funder, it was a governmental funder, wanted not just the names and affiliations of board members, but they actually wanted driver's licenses and social security numbers because the board is the fiduciary for the organization and for its grants. And one board member resigned rather than hand that over. And we had to, as a staff, go through our procedures for protecting the privacy of the board members' driver's licenses and social security numbers when they were not in use. We needed them for a particular report to a foundation or to a government agency, but after that, they needed to be stored in a secure location. So figuring out who's connected to what, who can bring you maybe other relationships with public sector organizations or private sector organizations, all of this can be important in trying to figure out who sits on your board or who should be sitting on your board. And often a committee of the board with staff input from the executive director will create a plan for recruiting new board members. And there are a number of ways to do that. The best is probably friends of the board. But sometimes your community may have a volunteer center that specifically attracts people that are interested in volunteering, and volunteering in an organization could include serving on a board, not just, standing in a soup line handing out, packages, but actually serving on a board. So check out whether you have a volunteer center in your community or maybe a volunteer bulletin board at your local newspaper or supermarket, even for that matter. So let's see, there we go. It's best practices, and we're getting into the area of a lot of best practices. You should have, what's normally a binder for each board member that gives them all the information that will help them be good board members. And that binder should include your mission statement, any vision statements you have, any values statements you have. Increasingly, nonprofits don't just have a mission statement, they'll have a value statement. This is how we operate. These are things that we believe in and that are important. The most recent financial statements would be included in that binder to give a good, accurate picture of where the organization stands. And I think any board member, worth their salt is going to want to know not just what are the operating financials, but what's the reserve, and how are you prepared as a nonprofit for turndowns in funding or reductions in donations. One of the rules of thumb that nonprofits aspire to is having 3 months or ideally even 6 months of operating revenue available in the event of emergencies. And that's usually a lot of money. And not many nonprofits, especially in the early stages, can reach that kind of reserve. What's the budget? What are the program descriptions? Often board members, will be on a board for some period of time and really not be able to describe what the organization does. So again, we're back to continually educating the board about the activities of the organization. You'll get some of that from the executive director at monthly board meetings. But in my opinion, it's the best practice to bring in other staff to explain in more detail what the organization does, how it does what it does, and why it does what it does. The binder should include the most recent annual report. And that's a best practice. Not every organization creates an annual report, but a best practice for nonprofits is to have an annual report and to post that annual report either on their website or, make it available to the community by an announcement in the local newspaper. The board member needs in the binder a copy of the bylaws. These become very important, especially if there's conflict within the organization. People will want to refer to the bylaws in those situations, and they become kind of the operating Bible for the organization. Also, kind of a note about bylaws, it's very easy for attempts to rewrite bylaws or to amend bylaws to really get people in the weeds. Bylaws can be, very tricky to amend because they are really legal documents, and sometimes there'll be some legal eagles on the board who will want to look at every I and dot every T, whereas other members on the board want to just kind of move on, get it done with. So that's kind of the tension that can sometimes exist within board members and within boards of directors. Ideally, having an organizational chart can help the board member really understand the scope and activities of the organization and a who's who. I've been in organizations where board members were kind of regularly coming and going, but really not understanding who the staff were besides the executive director. Who were the senior management, who were the senior management team of the nonprofit. Board policies and organizational policies should also be in the binder. A list of committees and some clear expectations on board giving. And I don't think that should be at the bottom of the list. I think it should be at the top of the list. If you're recruiting somebody to come to a board of directors and to serve on a board of directors, and if there are expectations for their financial participation in the organization through either personal donations or getting money, that should really be clear up front while the person is being recruited, not after the fact. And sometimes people don't like to talk about money, so they kind of, don't get to that. And somebody's on a board for a period of time, and all of a sudden they realize they need to make a donation and they weren't expecting that. Another thing about donations and boards is that ideally the quality of the donations coming from the board is set by the lead gift from the president or chair of the board. It's very unrealistic to expect, board members to give when there isn't a clear kind of leadership gift from the board president that maybe, kind of ups the ante for other board members who want to participate. So now we're going to get into some of the details of the role of board officers. And I think this is, probably pretty straightforward and probably stuff you already have some sense of. But the chair or the president is really the co-leader, if you will, of the organization. Most have a chief executive officer, a CEO, or an executive director, which is the terminology most commonly in use in the nonprofit world. And the relationship between the board leader and the staff leader is very, very important. If there is, conflict or struggle within that, the organization is going to have difficulties. At the same time, that relationship can swerve into the self-serving sometimes. I was involved with an organization many years ago where there was a very close relationship between the overall board and the CEO, and the board would basically do whatever the CEO asked it to do. And you ended up after a number of years with a CEO that had a very high salary level and a very good retirement package, but the rest of the staff didn't share in that. And that's an example of how there's a tension, if you will, between how the CEO or executive director interacts with the board and the board chair. But ideally, in a high-performing organization, the board president and the board chair are in sync, and often the board chair will run the board meetings and not delegate that to the executive director, but actually run the board meetings, and the executive director comes in with their monthly report, but it's clear that the board chair is kind of running the board and running the meetings. And I think that's the best practice too. But it's not uncommon in nonprofits for the executive director to be kind of running the board because that's the culture of the organization, but it should change to that best practice. So the history of the board is kind of captured by the secretary, who takes notes and regularly records key elements and key moments in the life of the organization. And those minutes can be very important because it may be that, you can't remember what happened last year or at a board meeting that occurred months ago. So the secretary's notes become quite important in memorializing those activities. And the treasurer is really the kind of the beating financial heart of the board of directors. And they need to have a really complete understanding of the financial elements of the organization. So they should have a strong financial background. If they don't, then the board can, serve to train them, of course, at a local community college on nonprofit financial management may be a very good thing for a board member to participate in, and for the organization to underwrite. Okay, we're getting close to end, and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the key elements of what a strong board culture can be. The board should establish and evidence a culture of inquiry. Okay, what is the organization doing? What does the community need? What does the community need from the organization? Those are the kinds of questions board members should have routinely. A strong board culture will also embrace the ongoing development of the board and growth of the organization. We mentioned a few slides back that organizations will often have a strategic plan. I think that it's good practice for a board of directors to have its own strategic plan. what does the board want to accomplish in terms of its role? And that might include recruiting a particular kind of new member or particular numbers of new members. It might also being more assertive in taking a role in representing the organization in the larger community and creating more visibility for the organization. These are things that can be on the board's plan that's different from the organization's strategic plan. There needs to be a healthy and respectful partnership between the board and the executive director. I don't think I can overstress this. And it sometimes comes down to a chemistry situation. I was involved with an organization as the CEO a number of years back. And when I came to the organization, the then board president and I had a very strong, very positive relationship. In fact, I often felt he kind of bent over backwards to do things that would initially attract me to the organization when they were recruiting me, and then to help me, in the role of the new executive director. But that changed when the leadership of the organization changed and that particular board member left the organization. And I can point a number of times in a number of boards and organizations that I've been involved with where the initial, board profile changes over time. A board of directors is a kind of an organic entity. And you can have, kind of a meeting of the minds among the founders and the initial members of a board who all believe that, this is what they should be doing. But over time, those individuals can move off, new individuals can come on, alliances within individuals can be developed. And sometimes the board finds itself in a very different place down the road. And this is where sometimes conflict can arise. So other parts of a strong board culture, trust and candor between board members. We really don't want to have factions on a board. Everybody needs to be hopefully headed in the same direction, facing the same way. And there needs to be a willingness to address poor board behavior that's having a negative impact. The board member, for example, who is not showing up, not appearing on conference calls, not getting their vote in on time. All of that can have a real bad effect on the morale of the board and perhaps even seep down into the morale of the organization. So disagreements and issues need to be thoughtfully and productively resolved at the board level. All of that goes toward putting together a strong board. Click. And this is another way of thinking about boards. What kinds of governance model do they have? There are some boards that are really focused on the policy aspects of the work that the organization is doing. So they may be off really, trying to represent the board in the policy arena of local government and nonprofit and philanthropy. Another governance model is more of a cooperative mission or board members who see more of a cooperation as the elements, the key element of a board. And that can go all the way over to community engagement, where the board really sees its role as being kind of representing a given community. And I think we're likely to see this within recovery community organizations, where you have a kind of a very clear mandate to serve the recovery community and perhaps the community of people in need of recovery or seeking recovery, depending on your mission statement and how you define your activities. And having that community represented on the board of directors directly, and being able to bring that perspective into the board and eventually down into the staff of the organization. All of that can be kind of captured in that community engagement philosophy of governance. The patron is defined, the patron role or type of governance heavily focuses on fundraising and networking, where board members are often expected to have the means to contribute themselves financially. And probably in most situations, there's a mixture of all these four different types of board governance models. So within boards, there are various leadership styles that can be evident. And, you know, there may be some difficulty in trying to move toward a particular leadership style or a particular governance type. And this could become the focus of a strategic plan for the organization or the annual strategic plan for the board to move more in this direction or that direction. But traditional leadership board of directors is hierarchical, emphasizing the structure, the formality, and the adherence to protocols. The chairperson or president guides discussions, sets agendas, and maintains order. Decisions are usually collective, relying on established norms and practices. Collaborative leadership. This kind of leadership encourages active participation from all members in discussions, decisions, and strategic planning. And very simply, it could mean a board president who really invites everybody to participate in a conversation or in a decision. What do you think, Joe? What do you think, Mary? Really kind of pulling people in and not letting them sit by the sidelines. The chairperson facilitates those discussions, promotes diverse perspective, and ensures all voices are heard. Then there's transformational leadership. And this can be pretty exciting if you've got a transformational leader. This person would inspire board members to think innovatively and beyond conventional boundaries. The chairperson, a visionary figure, encourages bold ideas, disruptive thinking, and a dedication to organizational growth and innovation. This style fosters a dynamic environment that promotes continuous improvement and adaptability. Well, that could be an exciting, organization within which to work, but it could also be really exhausting, that kind of leadership. And then I think hello? Somebody talking to me? No, okay. What works well for recovery community organizations is the model of the servant leader. The servant leader prioritizes the organization and stakeholders, and I would add service recipients, with the chairperson embodying humility, empathy, and a commitment to values while empowering others to excel. To me, this is the one that kind of resonates with me. I think probably resonates with a lot of people in recovery. 12-step, mutual aid organization where there's sponsorship and opportunities to serve are abundant and often a key part of a person's recovery. But choosing that leadership style, the board's leadership style, depends on the organization's stage, industry, culture, and board members, requiring a flexibility and open communication that are key for adapting and refining a style that supports sustained success, which is the kind of the holy grail of nonprofit organizations, sustaining success. So I think we're getting pretty close. A little bit about running effective board meetings. Send out the agenda early, start and end the meetings on time, implement Robert's Rules of Order. This is kind of the Bible for running a nonprofit, and it's easy to get information about Robert's Rules online. And in fact, the rules go back to the late 1800s when they were developed by some Army colonel and adopted by the Congress. Making sure that you've got somebody taking minutes, detailed minutes, focus on strategy, focus on decisions. Everyone has a chance to speak, and ensure that everyone knows what they're responsible for and make it really a team atmosphere. Here's some more about Robert's Rules of Order. We've often probably had some experience with them where somebody makes a motion, somebody seconds the motion, they amend the emotion, not the emotion, the motion, excuse me. And all of this can be, important in making decisions that have a level of accountability and objectivity associated with them. This is a kind of a recent question. Should you do digital voting? I think we are all fairly comfortable with getting email votes in or telephone votes in or proxy votes in. This is all, stuff that goes with making making decisions within nonprofits. This whole digital voting is a new kind of area that's opening up with software to support digital voting and not much that I actually know about. So we're going to skip that. And here's some of the stuff that goes on, key elements of a board meeting. There should be an agenda, reading of the previous meeting's minutes. Usually there's an executive director's report, a financial report. We've talked about what these reports entail. Board committee reports. Ideally, there's maybe a monthly or a bi-monthly meeting of the board, but committees can meet more frequently, and often that's where the real work of the organization takes place, is within the committees. Any correspondence that the board has been involved with, and any background information that needs to be discussed, and of course, any talk about new business. So we've gone through pretty quickly a lot of stuff. And I would encourage you to download the PowerPoint. And if there are particular areas of your own interest, doing some online search around nonprofit management is pretty easy to do these days. Hopefully we have in this workshop underlined the importance of bylaws in a new or startup nonprofit, understanding best practices in determining the board roles and responsibilities. And I think best practices is a key term here. Be familiar with Robert's Rules of Order. Have tools that effectively run board meetings. So agendas, binders, information at board members' fingertips so they can be good board members. And then some attention to understanding how to successfully recruit board members is part of what we've learned.
Perfect. Thank you so much, John, for such a great presentation. We do have a few questions on the Q&A box and on the chat, so I'll go ahead and read off the first one.
Okay.
So the first question, it says, can you address organizations that are in their infant stages? We created a strategic plan, but barely have time to address and act on. What is the solution to that? Most staff are busy with clients and participants, and admin staff is minimal.
Well, there's a lot in that question. If it's a startup board and there's only a few members, yeah, there's going to be a lot of work to be spread around a few people. So attracting new board members to do the work. And if it's a startup, hopefully the people who are the foundational board members and maybe the foundational staff can bring some of their excitement and energy to their friends and family members and engage other people to help with the task. I mean, if you're in a community, you're starting something that's new, demonstrating the excitement associated with that can be infectious, and hopefully you can find some other people to help. That's my advice, but go, baby steps. I mean, you're not gonna create a multi-thousand-dollar, multi-program organization overnight. Baby steps is what I would advise.
Great, thank you so much, John. So I'll go ahead and move on to the following question. It says, how do you suggest handling board retention and commitment?
Well, again, a lot flows from the leader. And it's been my experience that the president or chair is really key to what happens in a board. And if they're excited and committed, and that is coming across to the other board members, it is infectious. If on the other hand, they're kind of distracted and bored and, late arriving and not really responding to emails, a new leader is needed. And, sometimes it's the role of the executive director to talk to speak to power, okay? To say to the chairperson, this isn't working very well. Could you consider moving to the board or even resigning, because we needed a charismatic leader who can really, get this board excited and moving. It's not happening. But carrying that kind of message from the staff, from a staff person to a board chairperson, requires a certain amount of finesse and diplomacy. So let me leave it there.
Okay, great. Great. And for the following question, do you suggest board member term limits?
Yep. Yes, absolutely. I think one of the ways that a nonprofit can go bad, I think I touched on this earlier. I was involved with an organization that basically had the same board of directors for 15 years. And they were there to have lunch every month with the executive director, to kind of nod and rubber stamp whatever the executive director offered to the board for their consideration. There was really no independence among that board in terms of they were totally dependent on the executive director to give them information. And as a result, they were making, I think, a lot of mistakes. I left the organization partly because of that. The executive director's compensation was way out of line. The executive director's retirement benefits were way out of line. And, for example, in a best practice within a nonprofit is that there should not be a huge gap between staff salaries and executive director salaries or CEO salaries. And when it's really out of whack, it's evident to government funders and foundation supporters that there's something wrong with that organization. It's an ethical issue for a board to make sure that executive director compensation meets the kind of the community standards of executive director compensation, and there are ways to figure that out, and is not way out of whack with staff salaries.
Great, thank you so much. I did see
Rosalinda, the other information I put out there was a little more context for the question about retention and commitment.
Yes.
It wasn't lack of
Mhm.
energy or enthusiasm. That probably was a little bit more because we stepped into things they hadn't experienced. And so every time we've replaced a board member, we've gone back into a lot of training into them, and then they're kind of overwhelmed by what they stepped into. And it's just been a revolving circle. Or they found out that it didn't really align to their personal agendas after they'd taken the commitment. And so it wasn't what they thought it would be. So I put in there maybe that you do your recruitment using the orientation. Like, how do you avoid that? We've done it so many times.
Yeah, I think there's some due diligence to be undertaken in recruiting board members. And if you've got it down to, let's say, 2 or 3 potential new board members, somebody really needs to sit down with them and go through all the kind of the nitty-gritty of what the organization does and what's expected of board members. I think many times people are recruited because they're a friend of a friend, and they're kind of delighted to be kind of tapped to be a member of this organization's board, but don't really understand what's entailed in being a board member. One of the ways I would get their attention is to point out that when things go bad, in an organization, let's say there's that rare, but every now and then you read about the embezzlement of a nonprofit. Well, if the executive director has taken the money and decamped to the Cayman Islands, it's the board that's left holding the bag, and it's the board that is ultimately liable. And in fact, the board can be sued. The board can be, especially if they were participating in the malfeasance or ignoring the malfeasance through, ignorance and even maybe even, some involvement, they're on the hook, and boards can be sued and are sued. And when when you relay that information to a board, you get their attention. And they really want to be careful who comes on the board, what kinds of decisions they make, and what's going on within the organization in terms of the financial management.
Great, thank you, John. Deanna, I hope that answered your question, but if you have any other questions, just go ahead and raise your hand.
No, that was good. I just wanted to give some context because there are, specific things. And so that after I thought it through, maybe the orientation would be part of the recruitment so that up front they would know before an election or, putting them on the board for them to go, whoa, this is so much more than what I thought it was. And even in that, John, we've offered lots of classes. And then just, the commitment then pales because either it's more for the organization than what they thought it was. Let's say a personal interest in a mutual support aid in the community. So they think this is going to be a place for them to advocate for that. And when, that doesn't align or something else, the time commitment doesn't align, or they didn't realize that they were going to have to do fundraising also, or that they'd have to read reports in between. And so this constant turnover and retention and training new board members to have them leave again, it's insanity.
Yeah. I agree. I mean, and I don't think there's any simple solution. There are complex solutions, doing due diligence, making sure that potential recruits can see the big picture, not just the small picture of the enhancement to their own ego that occurs when they're selected to be on a board of directors.
I think term limit helps. And like you said, the chairman is such a critical position, and the co-chair who will then step into the chair position. Because otherwise it all falls on one's shoulders, which just gets to be way out of balance. Thank you. It's great to see you again, by the way.
Okay. I know we have a few more questions. I just wanted to quickly say though that this event will be until 1:15. So between 1:10 to 1:15, we will be wrapping up and just sending out the feedback survey link and the attendance survey so that you can sign in. So we'll go ahead and take a few more questions. I know we have 5 more minutes. But for the next question, what is there to do if the board doesn't hold the ED accountable to their organization's mission?
Well, that's a big problem. That kind of dysfunction, disconnect, is pretty toxic for an organization. And, in that situation, if the ED is clearly not implementing the directives of the board and the directives of funders, it would be incumbent upon the board to let that person go, to fire them. And just the flip side of that is increasingly people being recruited to executive director positions these days sometimes want a contract for their own protection. Okay. If an executive director is coming on board of an organization that's maybe been struggling, they might want a contract that would give them some guarantees that the rug won't be pulled out from under them, that they have, a period in which to get the ship right. But ultimately, you can boil down board responsibilities to 2 or 3 key things, and one of them is to hire, fire, and evaluate the executive director.
Okay, great. Thank you, John. For the next question, what size board would you recommend or see as best for a new nonprofit that has been open for 1 year? Doing very well and budget is in the $300K range. Right now we are 6 because we lost 1 board member. We are looking at new people, but they're difficult to find. Founder is vetting them before asking them on, but please advise on size. We have no committees at this point, too small of a group.
Okay, again, that's a complicated question because in some ways you want a smaller board because it's easier to reach consensus and make decisions. On the other hand, a larger board would allow you to have functioning committees that do the work and help the board, kind of streamline itself. I would say for a new startup, probably keep it less than 10 or 12. And if you want to get larger than that at some point, you can often create an advisory board or an advisory committee where you bring people on for specific functions, let's say to advance the organization in the community or to do fundraising. And those people are not on the governance board, but on an advisory board or an honorary board. I was recently asked to serve on an honorary board, first time. And I think the key element here is to talk about boards as being governance boards and using that terminology as much as possible. So people understand that it's not a honorary board, it's a governance board, it's a working board. Maybe that's another term that ought to be included. Come on, become a member of our working board. Be a member of our governance board. So it's really clear through what your terminology is that what their expectations are. In the recovery community, we've learned a lot about the importance of terminology. And maybe here we need to create more specific terminology when it comes to nonprofit governance.
Great, thank you. Okay, and I see that we have one more question. I know that we have just like 2 more minutes, so let's see if anyone has any other last minute question, please feel free to drop them into the chat. So it says, do you advocate unofficial student board membership as a means to cultivate conservatorship and expand horizons?
I'm not sure I understand that question. Would you read it again?
Yes, and then Phil, you can also feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to expand on this. It says, do you advocate unofficial student board membership as a means to cultivate conservatorship and expand horizons?
Student board membership, was that the term?
It would not be an official board position, but a position where they could provide input from resources that may not be available to older adults, depending on what the vision of your organization is and who you're serving.
Okay, well, I think if your organization is serving young people in any way, you should consider having youth on the board, on the governance board. And in fact, some nonprofits really require this of youth serving organizations. And also there's been a real move in the past 20 years to get youth more involved in boards of directors of nonprofits as a way of developing leadership among young people. And there are some organizations out there that help people do this. Usually there's a lot of resistance from the older members. We're like, whoa, wait a minute, we're going to have some 17-year-olds on this board telling us what to do. But in fact, the research around youth involvement in boards has been very positive, and youth bring an energy and a commitment and a perspective that doesn't exist with just adult board members. So I think given the time constraints, that's all I'll say about that.
Great, thank you so much, John. Okay, so with that being said, I am going to quickly just review the last steps and then just get everyone the attendance link, and then I'll just read the final question. I know Sarah just added one to the chat, but let me just review the rest of the steps before we answer this last question. Okay, so with that being said, that does bring us to the end of our 2Track event webinar. Here are a few resources for you all to see. We will be publishing these slides into the Grantee Hub so that you can have access to them. And then there's a variety of resources for you to use. So just take a look at that. Yeah, so there's plenty of resources and everyone is titled. Yeah, so there's some board resources, recovery resources, and other references that were used for you to view. Okay, great. We did drop the attendance survey and the feedback form to the chat, so please make sure to fill it out before you leave today so that we can go ahead and update your attendance for your program sites. So please go ahead and fill out the attendance survey and feedback form. Meanwhile, everyone fills that out. John, I'm just gonna ask you the last question that someone added to the chat. It says, you talked about the importance of not relying solely on the ED for insight into the organization's operations and finances. In a small organization where the director oversees all finances, how do you avoid over-relying on the director for that information?
Well, it depends on how small. If you're talking about, 4 or 5 staff, there is somebody who does the financial management, and they could be included in those board meetings along with the executive director, so that board members know who that person is, can ask questions of that person independent of the executive director. I think a good executive director and a good best practice is to bring other management staff to board meetings so the board can understand who else is involved in the day-to-day operations of the organization, and bringing in staff that provide services to talk about the services they provide and how, recipients receive those services.
Great, thank you, John. Okay, I don't see any more questions, so everyone just make sure that you're filling out the attendance survey and the feedback form. And just one last thing that Lonnie mentioned on the chat is that John is one of the consultants for Faces and Voices of Recovery. So if anyone would like to set up a TTA one-on-one call with John just to speak about further matter about board development or governance or anything else that you might want to speak to him about, you can always submit a grantee request form with your TTA needs, and then we'll go ahead and connect you with John. You can also specify on the grantee request if you'd like to meet with him specifically and directly so that we can initiate that conversation. So yeah, and with that being said, I think this concludes our call, but thank you so much, John. This was a great presentation. We really appreciated having you here with us today.
Thank
So
you,
thank you so
Rosalinda.
much.
Thank you.
Okay, awesome. So with that being said, everyone, please go ahead and submit the attendance survey and feedback form. We will be closing the room in 1 minute, so make sure that you grab the link before we close the room. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and then we'll speak to you soon. Thank you. Bye, everyone.